bit too robust for 1 hour. But we're going to talk about chemical and cultural strategies to control Poa annua in both cool season and warm season turf. And so we're going to start out with some introductory about Poa. I'm trying to stick to, it's basics, but it's things that hopefully will be good reminders for you all. We're going to talk about cultural suppression techniques, just, good common sense things to think about. I'm also going to hit a little bit on application equipment, and some of that's going to come into some recent research that's still ongoing at Virginia Tech. So there'll be some fresh information there. And then we're going to talk about kind of latest approaches as a general summary for control of Poa in cool season turf and also in warm season turf. So Poa identification, primary characteristics are going to be this folded vernation and a really large membrane ligule that you can see with the naked eye. That really helps out. And then you're going to be further confirming with the boat-shaped leaf tip. And if you get a hand lens out and look at that midrib, you'll see that it's slightly off center and that it's got two impressed lines that kind of look like railroad tracks. And so those are typical characteristics when you're trying to distinguish it from Poa trivialis, which is the closest mimic in turf. Poa triv is going to have more of an orangey reddish sheen to the foliage. I mean, they're both green, but Poa triv is going to have a lot more red coloration scattered in there. And Poa triv is going, the patches are going to occur more robustly early in the year, and they're going to be creeping more quickly than what you'll see from Poa annua. So a lot more stoloniferous activity there. I mean, if you got the white seed head, though, it's a given identifying Poa. It's more difficult in vegetative stages. On greens, we have different biotypes, which make for very difficult management challenges when you have multiple biotypes of Poa, as well as, I mean, on a lot of our older greens, multiple biotypes of bent grass. You will see we're coming up on fall of the year, and as soon as our frost starts to hit, you'll see all these different colored patches on your greens. Those are different biotypes of bent grass as well as of Poa. And you'll see that they can respond differently to herbicides. They also respond differently to environmental stresses such as that frost. And when you see that dark purple and red coloration, what you're seeing is cold-induced reduction in the root's ability to uptake nutrients. So you're seeing localized nutrient deficiency due to cold that affects some biotypes more than others. But when we talk about understanding Poa from a control standpoint, it's important to be able to educate yourself to be able to track population changes over time. Because with Poa, especially on highly managed turf, it's not about, all right, I'm going to implement a control strategy and then eradicate, at least in the short term, this weed. We can't do that with Poa on high-end turf like greens. Because we have to manage playability as well as try to suppress the encroachment of the weed. So some of this is more about encroachment suppression than it is about actually control or eradication, which we would be typically expecting with other weeds. So here's kind of a pictorial example. First of all, you got to be able to assess percent coverage. And so here you're looking at 5, 10, 20% cover shown in this diagram. And one way to think about cover assessment on your greens, look at how much Poa you think there is. And then while still standing there looking at the same spot, ask yourself, okay, if I said this is 20% Poa, would I say that that's only 80% bent? And you might decide, okay, no, this is more like 10% Poa and 90% bent. And you go back and forth until you can come to a decision on that. But here's when I talk about understanding that you're managing population encroachment, here's a great diagram to show that. If you had an initial situation that looked like the top left here, and then 2 years after treatment, it looks like the top right, you would say this treatment didn't work. It looks just like it did when I started. And my perception of that is less than 5% control 2 years later with a bunch of treatments. But if 2 years after you had a non-treated control plot that can show you that the lower left is what your population actually would have looked like if you had done nothing, then suddenly your perception is 75% control because you've been able to maintain the status quo, which was a 75% reduction on the expansion that would have occurred. And a lot of poa annua management is like that. And if you can't figure out ways on your course to track these things, there's a high potential for you to be throwing away a lot of money. You need to have some way to determine whether or not and to prove to the folks that are pulling the purse strings that the programs you're implementing are doing something. Here's an example of that in practice. In this case, the golf course superintendent has sprayed a demo plot. And in addition to having a non-treated demo on the left, they also put a doormat over the turf before they treated the treated area, so that they had a running check inside the treated area as well. So you can see poa annua everywhere on the left. You have clean poa annua on this treated area, and then boom, there's that doormat right there in the center showing them exactly what the situation would have been without treatment. So poa is difficult to control, but it's also, it's an invader. It's difficult to keep around. A lot of people, I mean, that's a badge of honor in the northern mid-Atlantic. If you manage poa greens, that's something that not everyone can do. It's very difficult because poa is not in it for the long haul, especially the annual biotypes. And here's a great example. In this case, they had predominantly poa greens, and they lost poa due to summer stress, and there was no poa sod available. So this L-shaped thing that you see here in the middle of the green is actually bent grass, because that's the only thing that they could get last summer for sod. And then they had winter stress that's taken out the poa and leaving the bent grass behind. So it's a testament to how sensitive poa is to environmental extremes. That's one of the reasons we try to keep it out of our managed turf, because it's undependable. Does poa annua affect golf play? We've done some research to try to finally prove, because a lot of people blame poor shots on poa, and a lot of academics have said that poa disrupts playing surfaces. Anyone who's putted a golf ball, you may question that. When you see your ball bouncing across greens and you see a lot of other surface anomalies, you may say, hey, if my putt's true, it's going to hold out either way. We wanted to know, so we went through essentially hell and high water to figure this out. We built a putting robot. We used high-speed video and collected a lot of data on various putts that either traversed a single poa annua patch, which you see in this image in the center there, or went over visually uniform bent grass adjacent to that transect that had the patch. And the question is, did the poa have an effect? And the answer is yes. We actually used a novel system of scoring the ball's trajectory using pressure-sensitive paper, so that we eliminated the dying roll of the golf ball, which is a huge source of error. When the ball no longer has enough inertia to overcome frictional forces of the green, it can turn left, right. That's why we putt. We're trained to putt past the cup. So we eliminated that from our data by using this pressure sensitive paper. And what you're seeing in this image on the upper right is a situation where the ball has rolled repeatedly, 10 balls rolled over a pure bent. And in the lower left, we're seeing a portion of a paper where 10 balls have rolled over a patch of poa. So this is just one example. The data is over here showing us that if we put hundreds of balls over visually uniform bent grass using a mechanical putter and all the other controls that we implemented to control error in this study, we get about a 5 millimeter plus or minus deviation in ball direction per meter of travel. So that's our perfect scenario with the putting robot on pure bent. If we add a patch of poa, it bumps up to almost 13 millimeters. And we were not able to even test these effects using the greens tester because there's too much inherent variation in how the ball exits the green tester. And we're talking about subtle differences that we're measuring on these golf greens. But yes, poa does negatively impact ball roll, such to, if you had pure bent and your aim was perfect, you would hold out that ball routinely at a distance of greater than 20 feet. But if you rolled over one patch of POA in that transect, it's going to reduce that distance to something more like 8 feet. And so that's a, it's a pretty significant difference that POA is causing. One of the reasons we believe that it's doing this is because there's a textural difference between the POA and the vent. When the ball encounters the POA, it launches the ball and it bounces more. And we track that with high-speed video and video tracking software. And you can see in this image, it's showing a tracked golf ball. And now we're looking at the y-axis here is in pixels. And so these are less than 1 millimeter per pixel. So that's why you see these huge deviations. It looks like the ball's bouncing all over the place. That's not actually the case. These are very, very subtle bounces that you're getting. The point is that after the ball encounters the POA, which is indicated by the blue line in the middle, we saw considerably more bouncing than we did. And the reason this thing seems to be going up into the sky is because of the ball's relationship to the camera. When we analyzed our data, we controlled for all of those effects to flatline the data. But anyway, suffice to say, POA does affect your golf putt. If we could get rid of it, it would be advisable to do so. Now, if you had a pure POA green, I doubt there would be any impact on your putt. In fact, it probably would putt better than pure vent. The problem is when you have this textural difference between, so if you have spotty POA, that's where you're going to have your worst putting conditions. All right, let's talk about how to kill it then if we don't like it. Cultural suppression. So primary cultural considerations to limit POA invasion would be these. Choosing the appropriate turf for the environment. We don't always have control over that. Sometimes we're choosing the appropriate turf for the play that's intended on the site. So you're going to have to deal with that. Anytime you err from these cultural considerations, your management intensity in terms of products you have to purchase and control strategies you have to implement go up. Keep the surface dry. Try not to, you want dry surface conditions, so you want to water infrequently and deeply when the environment affords you the ability to do that. Now, as your bentgrass roots recede in the summer, frequent light irrigation is what you need to do. So you need to do what you need to do. So always remember, culturally, what culture is the growing of the grass, culturing that grass. So the most important cultural consideration is do what you need to do to grow your grass to be as happy as it can be in the conditions you're afforded. So let me just say that as an aside. But if we can limit surface moisture periods, especially during the prime germination time of POA, by all means, you need to do so. You need to water infrequently. Mowing correctly, avoiding compaction. These are all things that reduce the competitiveness of your desirable turf and thus give POA the rare ability for those seedlings to actually survive, because they're out there and they're germinating all the time by the millions. But our turf kills most of them, and the happier turf you have, the more POA seedlings are going to die soon after they emerge. And that's what we want to maximize. So in the area of choosing appropriate turf grass, why do we do it? It reduces management inputs for one, and reduces POA seed production. So the more competitive our turf is, the less POA we actually have, and the less POA we have, the less POA seed production we get, and the less we're moving it all over the rest of our managed property. All right, match the turf type to the climate is how you're going to choose the appropriate turf, and consider reduced input areas that can utilize more competitive grasses or more competitive grass management systems like non-mow fine fescue. So turfgrass competition is dependent on the turf species, as I've just alluded to, but it's also dependent on the environment and how we have to manage the turf. Here's just a kind of an estimate of the relative competitiveness of different types of turf, depending on how they're managed. And for example, tall fescue, if it's managed at a very low height of cut, it's going to be very poorly competitive with POA. But managed at a higher height of cut, it's one of the most competitive species with POA. And you can see how the others shake out here. There's some grasses, zoysia grass and Bermuda grass, for example, they're some of the most competitive grasses on the planet, but they have a dormancy period. And POA, especially in the southern United States, exploits that dormancy period. And we have kind of this annual cycle of POA in managed turf where turf goes dormant, and that reduces the overall competitiveness of the turf with those species as well. All right, so we're talking about cultural practices. We're talking about keeping turf happy. And here we see a situation of turf that obviously is not happy, and we've seen a lot of images that look like this up and down the mid-Atlantic this year. And there are a number of factors that can cause this, but it's primarily, the fundamental cause is moisture related. So when you have drought conditions, your roots recede. So you have this very fragile, shallow root system, and then you go over with a mower and cause mechanical damage, and it leads to, death in the mower tracks. The root cause of this particular image, though, was white grubs. Exact same thing going on. This is an irrigated site, and it gets irrigated routinely. And this was the net effect. And you look at it and you say, wow, man, this looks droughty. And the reason it looks so droughty is because the grubs have literally eaten all the roots in this area. We were probably 5 orders of magnitude above the treatment threshold for grubs at this site. But any situation that causes loss of roots or causes droughty conditions or both can lead to this kind of mechanical injury. All right, this is another mechanical injury caused for a different reason. This is driving on the turf during frost. So these are just common sense things that you want to try to minimize, because everywhere things like this happen, it reduces the subsequent competitiveness of your turf, and it's going to leave an opening for weeds like POA to come in. We talked about choosing the right turf for a given area. Now that depends on the time of year, and you can say, oh, well, this image was chosen because I'm looking at Williamsburg midsummer. But there's something to be said for this image, though, for Williamsburg in midsummer, because I would argue that warm season grasses are a better adapted grass type than cool season grasses in the most eastern extremes of Virginia. And yet tall fescue continues to be our predominant species of choice for lower management or lawn height turf. But there are other options out there that can do better in those warmer climates. Anytime that you can, scrutinize gameplay or other use of whatever type facility you have, such that you're able to manage reduce input grasses on large areas, especially areas adjacent to where human traffic is going to be occurring, that's a huge boon to help you reduce the amount of POA populations and the amount of POA seed heads that those humans are going to be walking through, picking up seed and moving them to other places on the facility. And so that is an added benefit beyond the reduced management inputs. Now, and I've seen it, believe me, I know a lot of people would argue, hey, those aren't reduced management areas. I spend more of my time trying to manage weeds in reduced management areas than I do on the high-end turf, because a lot of the weeds that we encounter, we don't really have good management strategies for, and we end up having to do a lot of labor-intensive stuff. But the fundamental argument that I'm making is still valid. If you can manage areas in a more competitive state against POA, then you have less POA to spread elsewhere on the course. We talked about keeping the surface dry. Why would we want to do that? Because it prevents POA seed germination or the subsequent seedling survival if they do germinate. How do we do that? Monitor the site to give the grass what it needs and basically nothing more. Eric, I'm already falling behind my predetermined speed that I wanted for this presentation. So I'm gonna pick it up. So anytime we have, we're managing the culture of the turf. So anytime we have voids for whatever reason, this could have been standing water that causes it to scald. It could have been compaction. But if we have these voids, we're going to end up with POA in these voids. And so, that's what really we're talking about with cultural practices. Mowing correctly, using sharp blades, trying to reduce the amount of scalping, following the 1/3 rule where possible. Definitely stuff like this is absolutely unacceptable because it shocks the turfgrass plant. It's very difficult for the turf plant to heal all of those abrasions compared to a clean cut. And it opens up the canopy while the turf is suffering, and seedlings of weeds will survive during that period. Avoiding compaction, that's going to be in managing the compaction or altering traffic flow, anything you need to do. Here's a situation where tire tracks caused by the cleanup lap on a green. If you don't have the budget to use walking mowers, then don't mow the cleanup lap every mowing. Alternate, slow down, train your employees to slow down, because it's really the G-force is pushing on those tires as they come around that cleanup wrap at Mach 3 that leads to these type of issues. And when you get that scalping because of those impressed tire tracks, you end up, losing turf and then gaining POA and other weeds as a result. All right, moving off of cultural practices and on to application equipment. I have some new research that I want to share with you all related to application equipment, but also it doesn't hurt, just to talk about this briefly, because any changes that you make that improves the ability of you to deposit your pesticide uniformly to the target will make a huge difference in your overall weed control success. Now, flat fan nozzles that you see here in the top center, they're going to give you better weed control efficacy almost all the time. But if you can't deliver those droplets, which are going to be predominantly small droplets, to the target, then you're not getting better weed control efficacy, and you're getting unwanted activity on Karen's tomatoes halfway across the facility. And so we typically use induction type nozzles, and they do what they're supposed to do. They reduce the overall drift because they're creating large droplets that are entrained with air. They're designed to splatter on impact so that we turn a large droplet into a lot of small droplets. We use turbo T-jet induction nozzles in all of my research at Virginia Tech, and we control weeds just fine. And so induction nozzles do work, but I would still say you're going to get a 10 to 15% increase in performance with flat fans if you don't have windy conditions. All right, on the topic of sprayer equipment, here's a good example of just something to share with you all. This is overinflated sprayer tires causing these imprints on a green, basically stiff sidewalls, and you get, an imprint of the tire track across the green. And so that's true for any equipment, but especially a sprayer that's going to be carrying a heavy fluid load on it. You need a good mechanic that knows what's needed. Basically, the less inflated your tires are, the less ground pressure that's going to be exhibited to the ground. Basically, the ground pressure is going to be what the pressure in the tires are. If it's 20 psi, you're putting 20 pounds per square inch on the ground. If it's 8 psi, you're only putting 8 pounds per square inch on the ground, which is about the same as a human walking. Now, here's a different type of track. Now, obviously, it has something to do with herbicide being sprayed, but it's not being caused by the sprayer tires. This looks more like mower tires to me. And I think Eric Fraser rightfully argued that this was the fact that the mower tires have laid the grass blades flat prior to the spray application. So we're seeing phyto where the tires had traversed. Now, this is a phenomenon that we see quite often, yellow tire tracks on turf. And probably the most common argument for why it's happening that I've heard is this argument that was made in Eric's blog at Willow Oaks about laying the tire tracks flat and increasing. So basically, a flat leaf blade is going to harvest, let's say, 30 or 40 droplets. Whereas if that same leaf blade were upright amongst a bunch of other leaf blades, you're only getting 2 or 3 droplets per leaf blade. So you get 30 on this one if it's laying flat, and sometimes none on some of the others, or you get 2 or 3 per leaf. That's the argument. And so this one that got 30, that whole shoot's going to turn yellow. The leaf that got the 30 plus the other leaves on that shoot. That's the theory. It's not necessarily proven, but it's the most common argument that I've heard. But I got another one for you, and it's based on research data that we are actively developing. And I believe, I am confident at this point with what we've done that this phenomenon is a thing. Now, whether it explains all cases is highly debatable. I doubt it does. But what you're looking at here is This is some of our spray deposition work, primarily that we're working on for spray drones. But this is our ground sprayer comparison. All right, and those dark streaks are the tire tracks. So what's happening here, now these pieces of paper were set out outside in the environment one at a time, and a sprayer was sprayed over them, okay? And the sprayer goes over the paper first. I'm sorry, the tires of the machine go over the paper first, and the boom comes behind after the tires have passed over. So why am I getting these two? And what we quantified the dye that landed on this paper, I can tell you this is 2 to 3 times the intended application rate on these tire tracks. So we're putting a 2 to 3x rate on the tire tracks. Again, tires have already left the paper before the spray hits the paper. I think what's happening is when your sprayer is aiming into the wind, and let's say you have a 5 or 6 or 7 mile an hour headwind coming straight at your sprayer, that wind is cutting around those tires and creating eddies behind the tire. Those eddies, like a little whirlwind, they're harvesting droplets and depositing them right behind the tire. That's what I think is happening here, and I think it explains a lot of those straight line discolorations that we see in managed turf that's been sprayed with a conventional sprayer. And I believe that the speed needed to get this to happen is between 8 and 12 miles per hour. Our work on this is not done yet, but and so basically, if you're traveling 4 miles an hour into a 6 mile an hour headwind, you're going to get the phenomenon. But if you turn at a different direction or the headwind is coming with you, you probably will not see these tracks. That's why we see them sometimes and we don't see them other times. So that's the theory at this point. I do believe that there's an impact from this. I don't know of what magnitude or at what level it explains everything that we see out there in the real world. A little bit more deposition work that we're doing on spray drones. This is the biggest problem I see moving forward with spray drone technology is drift. I do believe that we have ideas for how to mitigate this problem, but it's a real problem with the out-of-the-box drone. And you're looking at 1% of the actual intended deposition rate is moving out to 24 feet away from the drone on an intended spray swath of 7.5 feet to the right of the drone. And we're getting probably 10 or more droplets per square centimeter. That's thousands of droplets per square meter out to 48 feet away from that drone. Definitely enough to cause off-site target or non-target injury to adjacent plants. Another phenomenon that we've uncovered in our drone work, and I also think I've talked a little bit about flat fans versus induction nozzles. Here's a great example. If you look at these top two images, flat fan on the left, induction on the right, you can clearly see the difference in fine droplets that you're going to get between these two technologies. And I think it's an important difference for the TNO industry and why you would want to use induction nozzles for most of your spraying. But furthermore, when you look down at the lower images, what you're looking at is distances away from the sprayer, vertical drop, no wind condition. All right, 1.5 feet down to 30 feet. Do you notice that all the tiny or real fine droplets are disappearing? So what we see as we traverse that distance is all the small drops are gone. We only see big drops remaining. And the reason is they have evaporated. So these spray drones out of the box with these 01 nozzles and stuff, you cannot operate them at the manufacturer suggested heights. These folks didn't factor everything in that they needed to factor in on what they're trying to tell people to do with these things. We're measuring over 60% product loss before it can even reach the ground in our research. And so, I mean, that's substantial. We're also proving that at higher heights, these things do not deliver efficacy, even in no wind environments, but at lower heights, they do. So evaporation is a huge hurdle to overcome for any situation where a drone manufacturer is recommending that the drone be flown at heights above about 3 meters, which is barely 9 feet above the ground. And so, our drone will barely let us go down to 2 meters, so about 6 feet. And even there, we're measuring losses. And so just something to think about, especially if you're considering a drone for future applications. Now, a little bit about targeted application technologies. This is an area where one of my grad students is conducting a chapter of his PhD work. So we know that dabbers and spot sprayers, they've traditionally been marketed for non-selective herbicides. And here's a couple examples. Nadazomet is not going to be used through this type of equipment. That's Basamid. But glyphosate's a great example of a product that is typically used, with a dabber. And when you use non-selective herbicides, you kill the weed. In this case, the target was Poa trivialis. You kill the weed and the bent grass. And it takes, here we are 70 days still trying to grow that back in. But if we were to use a semi-selective herbicide, like if we blanket apply bispirobacter at high rates on Poa trivialis, we have the high probability of getting a lot of bent grass injury. But if we dab it on, we get a better response, at least than the non-selective. So that's the premise. So when you start using selective products and you release the interns to go and spot treat, what we often end up with is situations like this. And I'm gonna tell you, this is not Roundup. This is actually PoaCure. So this is a situation where PoaCure was dabbed with one of the leading dabbers on the market. And it literally looks like Roundup. They got complete kill of Poa and bent grass very rapidly, within a couple of weeks. And so my grad student actually was one of the interns, and he was on an internship in Montana, and they used PoaCure in this manner with dabbers, and he came back wondering, why did we kill that turf? So he decided, let's do some research with targeted application devices such as dabbers. And you see, we've got one little spot sprayer, this Jerry's Weed Stick, and then we have a number of dabbers. This Weed One Magic on the right, he did a Twitter survey, and I think 70% of the respondents, and it was quite a few respondents nationwide, mostly from the golf industry, indicated that they used this device, Weed One Magic. So that was the one that, but anyway, we chose several devices that were commercially available for this purpose. Did some research, and I want you to look at this carefully, because most superintendents, and I've even had USGA agronomists, indicate that their standing recommendation was just take a sample out of the spray tank that you would spray at 1 gallon per thousand and use that in your dabber. Okay. So we typically, if we're spraying herbicides, 1 gallon per thousand, well, this is what the dabbers are putting out in gallons per thousand. And this is on the average as well. The Weed One Magic averages 17 gallons per thousand. And Weed Saber and so on and so forth. You see, all of these had extremely high output, from 8 up to 17 gallons per thousand. But check out these red bars. What are they? That is the standard deviation. So essentially, this Weed One Magic is 17 gallons plus or minus 10 gallons. So it could be 27, or it could be 7, or 10, I'm sorry, 10, close to 10. So 10 to 27, that's a huge, unmanageable, unsustainable, not very good range to be dealing with if you want to calibrate a device to deliver a selective herbicide to turf. And it's interesting, 3 of the products had these massive standard deviations, and the other 2 didn't. Well, the big difference is this is a spray device, Jerry's Weed Stick. And all 4 of these are dabbers, but this little bingo dabber, if I go back, you see they have these tiny little containers. All the rest of these dabbers have these long handles, and the fluid is held in the handle. So all the fluid is stacked on top of a very small surface at the very bottom of the dabber. So there's gravitational force pushing down when the thing is full, but when it's near empty, it doesn't have hardly any force, just like the bingo dabber. There's not a lot of force and so when we look at the Weed One Magic, that one that I mentioned that was the most commonly used, we're going from 32 gallons per thousand when it's full, all the way down to 8 gallons per thousand when it's empty. And so there is no way to calibrate such a device. So how would one use a dabber to put out a product like PoaCure? PoaCure is an expensive product. Once we've done the broadcast applications and we have our greens clean, or even while we're doing that, if there's a few really stubborn Poa plants that we want to go out and get a little more aggressive on, a dabber is a great way to supplement broadcast programs with PoaCure. How do we calibrate this thing? And what I recommend is you take this dabber, like this Weed One Magic, you get down about 25% of its total handle height from the bottom and cut it and install a valve there. Glue in a like a PVC ball valve. And then you open that ball valve, fill the container completely with solution that you want to dab, calibrated to about 8 gallons per thousand. And then after you filled it, close your ball valve. That's going to remove all the gravitational force from above off of that lower fluid, so that every time you dab, you're going to be down in that lower 25 percentile, which we've found stays pretty consistent at about 8 gallons per thousand. And then once you deplete that lower 25 percentile, open your ball valve and then reclose it. And you can replenish the lower part of the container. That would be how I would recommend proceeding with a dabber. All right, so let's move off and get to the meat and potatoes of this presentation. Now, 30 minutes into the talk, 39 minutes into the talk. Chemical and control and cool season turf. We're going to cover PGRs as well as herbicides. And so if you're actually looking to suppress POA in some way, shape, or form, these would be the plant growth regulators you would use, with the lion's share of the load being carried by paclobutrazol and fliprimidol. Prohexidine calcium is kind of, I would liken it as a primo mimic that has a little more activity on POA than primo. So there's a little bit of suppression there compared to primo. Whereas paclo and fliprimidol, if managed properly, you can actually reduce POA populations over time with those products. The primary strategy with PGRs, you're going to use high rates when you're allowed to, which would be the maximum growing periods of spring and fall. The best way to do this is to measure clippings and increase the nitrogen on low yield and increase the plant growth regulator rate on high yield. And the way I describe PGR use, especially on greens, is you can be lean and mean on your greens. Low nitrogen inputs, three pounds or less per year. Other managed deficiencies on the green to manage growth rate. You can do that. You can have fast greens. You can have beautiful greens. Or you can do PGRs, but you should not be trying to do both. You should not be trying to maintain a reduced nitrogen condition on greens, or any other reduced nutrient input condition, such as reduced phosphorus or some of these other, lowering the pH, some of these other programs that have been shown to reduce POA. But you should not couple those programs with PGR use. It needs to be one or the other. If you're using PGRs, you actually need to increase nitrogen, because what you're trying to do is suppress the growth of POA more than you suppress the growth of desirable turf. So you're actually pushing your desirable turf with nitrogen to grow over and out compete the POA. I mean, that's the overall strategy there. So it's a combination of making sure the turf has what it needs while you're trying to suppress the POA. When you get summer stress, you need to reduce your intensity of these aggressive PGRs and either move back to primo or dramatically reduce the rate of things like Trimit or Cutlass. As far as rates, I can't give you specific rate advice. If I get 20 superintendents in a room and I ask them what their Trimit rate is, I get 20 answers. And it's going to be based on local site conditions and dialing in the turf needs. And then it's a struggle back and forth between nitrogen aggression and PGR aggression during the times of year when you have the leniency to do that. There's been a lot of talk about using growing degree days to trigger plant growth regulator applications, and a lot of talk about biodegradation or metabolism of things like primo, which has led us to a 200 growing degree day based application frequency for primo. So I modeled, using 60 years of weather data for Richmond, Virginia, I modeled in Excel on this day of the year for the last 60 years, and this is on any day, how long would I have to wait before I applied another application of primo? In other words, how long would it take to achieve 200 growing degree days? And this is looking across the entire year, and I was blown away by the result. You're looking at it. This is 60 years worth of weather data. Basically, if you're in the spring, April or earlier in Richmond, this growing degree day timing thing is meaningful. And if you're in the fall, it's also meaningful. So when we have fluctuating temperatures, using the 200 growing degree days to trigger your application makes all the sense in the world. But for the vast majority of the time during summer, it bottoms out at about 10 days. So somewhere close. So you could choose 7 or you could choose 14, depending on the rate you're using. But for most of the summer, it's going to be a repeated frequency of 7 to, the data says 10 days, but, pick your poison. Now, this is for primo. And I've got a note up here. What do we do for trimming? I would tell you to go look at Bill Krauser's work and look at what the application intervals are for trimming. In my opinion, trimming application, I don't even like applying, and I don't have the experience that Krauser and some others do on PGR use. So I don't want to dismiss what they're doing, but my opinion is that Trimmett and cutlass aggression should be based on, should be acted upon in cool times of the year. You need to, I would just get off of them or cut 50-50 with primo or reduce the rates one way or the other in the summer, or maybe just get off of them completely in the summer. Of course, then you have to manage rebound. But I don't know about growing degree day timings for those, because I think it's more of this interplay between nitrogen aggression, and it's based on your clipping yield is what it should be based on. Because this is what you're trying to do. You're trying to suppress POA and let bent grass grow over the POA. All right, generics versus proprietary products. We have not seen differences in those. Typically, if I were going to make general statements, Trimmett is more aggressive against POA than Cutlass. And then again, your rate needs to be fluctuated based on the environmental condition and the clipping yield of your bent. Here's a great example from the late A.J. Powell on kind of how the primary PGR stack up on POA. Here's an untreated check in their work. This is a full season's worth of treatments for the PGRs that I'm about to show you. I think it's 8 applications. Yeah, this is Cutlass at 8 ounce per app, 8 times. This is the non-treated, 19% on the average, down to 9% on the average. Trimmett brought us down to 5% on the average. This plot doesn't look much better than the Cutlass plot, but it was 5% on the average. So Trimmett was a little bit better. And then Primo, it went up to 23%. Probably not statistically different from the non-treated, but if anything, Primo is managing stress for POA just like it would for bent. And so it's suffice it to say, it's not going to help you reduce POA populations. All right, moving on to herbicides, and I'm picking up the pace a little bit to try to get this done within an hour. These are the primary herbicides that I'm going to cover for cool season turf. Just a little introduction. It's difficult, especially on lower heights of cut, to go after POA aggressively and still maintain integrity of your turf surface. Here's an example of exonerate herbicide on bentgrass greens in California. Application uniformity is also important. Here's injury from an overlap of Anderson's crab and goose on bentgrass green. Now, this application was not intended to target POA. This would have been a spring application, but we could use Anderson's crab and goose. In fact, it's one of the, we've got some serious raised eyebrows looking at that product right now for fall POA programs. Like, for example, pre-cover on Bermuda greens. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I get to the warm season section. Also, be mindful of products that are used close to greens. In this case, it was flumioxazin drift onto a green. They sprayed right up to the edge and had drift and what looks like some potential runoff moving across the green as well. Here's curb or pronomide, and that's another one in the ultra dwarf world that's getting a lot of new attention. And don't forget, folks back in the day would have known, but we're not as familiar with curb nowadays. That is a highly mobile product. In this case, curb was sprayed on Bermuda grass upslope of that bent, and it's washing over the green. All right, amicarbazole is the first out the gate. Now, this is a triazine, so don't forget that this product is not going to be effective on triazine-resistant POA. And this is much more of an issue for southern areas where there's a lot of warm season turf, but in Virginia, we have both. I mean, over half of our golf courses are Bermuda grass golf courses, although we don't have quite as deep a history as triazine use as some other southern locations. In fact, for a long time, triazines were not registered in Virginia due to the soil types that we had. But at any rate, it is a triazine, and it is highly, highly effective on Poa annua if used properly. The problem is we have to manage turfgrass injuries, so we have to reduce the rates down to where we are walking that fine line between injury and control. Here's amikarbazole at 2.5 up to 5 ounces. In some of the early work that we did, we can control POA at below 2.5 ounces. We can go out with repeated applications of 1 ounce, and that's how we maintain turf tolerance while upping the aggression on POA. Here's some examples of some fall and spring data. Fall applications at 1 ounce, not too effective. Spring applications, much more effective. Fall and spring applications, also effective. Here's some serious injury that occurred when amikarbazole was under an experimental use permit. This is in Richmond. We are looking at this green 2 months after the injury peak. Okay, and so the injury was severe, and 2 months later, they're still trying to grow the green back in. This is when they discovered that this product really, really needs to be applied at between 50 and 80 degree temperatures, because they had record heat that year in Richmond and in some other areas in the mid-Atlantic, and it wrecked a lot of greens. And so that's kind of a standing recommendation, 50 to 80 degrees. So I got back on Excel and I wrote another model that was asking, okay, on this day of the year, or tell me out of the last 60 years, how many, when would I see, how many days out of the year would I have a situation where for 1 week, centered around a given day, for 1 week, my max temperature would fall between 50 and 80, okay? And for Richmond, the peak is in April at about 25 out of 60 years. And in Blacksburg, the peak is in early May at about almost 35, almost or right about half out of 60 years. And so your chances of, so you got a 1 in 2 chance of meeting these criteria. Now that's a pretty stringent criteria for your high for an entire week to be between those 2 temperatures. So don't think that that's what you have to have happen to use Exonerate effectively. Really, these data show you when peak performance would happen with Exonerate in Richmond and Blacksburg. All right, key strategies with this product. Great to clean up cool season roughs. In my opinion, the product was, they missed the boat. They went after high-end, low height of cut, really expensive price, and where we really had needs were in reduced management areas to clean up POA, like in roughs, where the product doesn't have the injury issues and works really well. Be aware, spray when prevailing temps are between 50 and 80 degrees. ProGrass, this is in my opinion, underutilized product. It has a lot of uses for the cool season market, but it became really heavily marketed in the Deep South for use on overseeded turf. And that's pretty much, that's a bulk of the market for the product, but it has a lot of uses in the North. In the North, we're looking at 3 application programs, typically November, December, and a follow-up when things start to warm up in March. Not for use on zoysia grass, does have resistance, potential buildup of resistance, and also heavily dependent on environmental conditions. Key strategies, I like to use it during fall establishment because it's really safe on young turf. You can use it at seeding. You can use it soon after seeding. Keeps POA out of tall fescue roughs, that sort of thing. In fairways, the 3 application approach on cool season, such as bentgrass and bluegrass, works pretty well. And you can see, oops, sorry. And need cold winter conditions for this thing to work. And also don't forget that there's 2 formulations out there. There's the older EC formulation and a newer SC formulation, and they don't have the exact same loading rates. So your rates are actually, your product rates are going to be quite different to reach the same amount of active ingredient between those two. Tenacity, for POA, the primary use of this product would be in the fall, just like I just mentioned about ProGrass. In the fall, when you're establishing new turf, such as Kentucky bluegrass, if you want to keep POA out, and in this case, you would apply low rates, 2 to 4 fluid ounces per acre. Apply that 3 to 4 times at 2-week intervals in the fall while you're growing that grass in. And on that 2-week interval, it'll keep the POA at bay. But you have to hit the POA when it's emerging, when it's germinating. You can't go after more mature plants at those low rates of tenacity. Here's just an example where that has worked for us at Virginia Tech. All right, POA Cure. This is an image of the first whole putting green that was treated in the United States. It was Spotswood Country Club up in Harrisonburg, Virginia. They put a 4x4 sheet of plywood out as a check plot. And this, what you're looking at, is the following spring after 3 fall applications were applied to that green back in 2009. This product works. It works really well. The biggest thing that we're managing with POA Cure is not so much bentgrass response, although we can have negative, with any herbicide, you can have negative bentgrass response. Here you're looking at some injury that we observed at 2, 3, and 4x rates in hot weather. And just to, I mean, this shows injury, right, from POA Cure. Anytime you have weather conditions that make you pretty much lose all of your bentgrass roots, POA Cure is going to exacerbate that problem. But at the same time we were doing this POA Cure work, we also were evaluating Chameleon, which is, it's an experimental that's under evaluation for registration in the US right now. And its namestay is phenomenal safety with this product. And yet we had catastrophic, during this really extreme environmental condition in Richmond, this is the same year that the amikarbazole stuff went down, it was record heat. We lost turf due to Chameleon. And you know, the POA Cure plots have all mostly recovered out here. We've got some other environmental issues, but you don't see any other plots in this trial except the Chameleon plots. Works great on POA annua and can work on POA trib. It takes high rates to get POA trib, and the higher your height of cut, the more product you need to use to achieve the same result. Here's an example of POA trivialis control with methiazolin at 4 kilos per hectare. And you compare that to velocity, which is labeled for POA trivialis control, and 1 year out. See, that's a problem. Velocity hastens dormancy of POA trib, but when we come back and assess a year later, we often don't see population reduction. All right, so and we've published on that work. Here's an example of the carnage that can happen. You get aggressive with POA Cure and you start taking POA out on a more rapid scale. That's why the programs with POA Cure are designed really slow, like 2 years, 5 applications per year, these really low rates. It's trying to prevent something like this from happening. And it's POA that's dying there, but you know, we can't compromise putting quality. And so you give it a little bit of time though, and all that. What I found is when this has happened, by the time the haters rally their troops to go after the superintendent, which takes a few weeks, the greens look so good by then that they're, you know, they lose their arguing points, because the bentgrass fills in the voided areas and the putting quality improves dramatically. Usually takes 3 to 4 weeks under a catastrophic event like this in springtime to get that back. And I'll tell you, it's a hard 3 to 4 weeks for any superintendent that has to go through it. And that's why when we say that it's a slow process, these spring apps are not designed, they, you know, they may discolor the POA, but they're not designed to take it out. A lot of people are looking at, they don't even see the discoloration. They're saying this product's not working. Biggest problem with POA Cure, people jump off the program before they complete all the treatments, because they don't think what they expected to happen is happening. Trust me, folks, you do not want this happening. You know, it may be what you think you want to see. You want to see the POA dying, but you don't want it happening at that rapid a rate. Product really safe. I don't have time to talk about all of this stuff. Let's move on to the warm season turf discussion. What caused this? This is actually interesting. They came out, and I'll go ahead and admit, this is the Turf Research Center. I'm not going to say who did this. This is a long time ago. This is back in early 2000s. But they came out with a ride-on sprayer under high wind and sprayed Roundup. And what you see here, this shape is actually wind-induced non-uniformity of pattern. The wind shifted the pattern from the sprayer over. So to fix that problem, after everything was nice and beautiful and brown, they came back a few weeks later and picked up all these escapes of POA with spot treatment with Roundup. And what you're looking at is Tifway greenup. So this is Roundup induced delayed greenup. Just ignore these strips of sod. That was some other research project that we were working on. All right, check this out. POA control with Roundup Pro 14 days after treatment. We have non-treated on the left. We have 36 ounces per acre Roundup Pro in the center and 36 ounces per acre Roundup Pro on the right. If I had time, I would love to engage with you all and try to get a bunch of answers from you as to why. What are some things that can happen? I'll just go through and list a few. This could have been droughty, right? You know, that would have reduced uptake, reduced overall performance. What if we had non-uniformity of application? This plant got more product than this plant. You know, if there's a sprayer setup issue or just the wind drift that I just showed a moment ago could have caused such an effect. What if this were a resistant biotype? So all of these are factors, but none of them are the correct one. And here it is. These were grown in a growth chamber. They were sprayed on the same day, same rate, same bottle. You know, everything was under the same spray chamber. But then they were returned to an 80-degree or a 60-degree growth chamber. So huge difference in the rate or speed of activity. And this is true not just for Roundup, but for a number of different herbicides, especially the amino acid inhibitors like ALS inhibitors or Roundup or glufosinate. So cold weather negatively impacts performance of products. This is a summary of 3 site years of research on dormant zoysia grass in Virginia. And we've got a number of products here. So 4M sulfuron revolver at 17 ounces. I've got the product price per acre. Now this is online consumer buy it online type prices. So they'll be a little inflated compared to your local landscape supply, I'm sure. But 4M sulfuron, 17 ounces per acre, $153. We're getting 96% control. Tribute total, $262, 95% control. This is POA annual control on a truly dormant zoysia grass. This would have been applied in February. Glyphosate plus simazine. If you don't have simazine resistance, and simazine is an awesome product for POA control. And $39 for that program at 99% control. Glyphosate at 16 ounces, which is the max rate that I would recommend for dormant zoysia. You can go 32 ounces on Bermuda, but not the zoysia. $8. That's at current glyphosate prices. Glufosinate at 6 quarts gave us 77% control at $186. At 3 quarts gave us 38% control. Diquat, $32. It's a little bit more affordable, but only gave us 30% control. That's Diquat at 1 quart. So, and I have seen, in particular, if there's any of these products that tend to deviate from what you see here, it would be glufosinate. I've seen, like this year, glufosinate knocked it out of the park. We were getting almost complete control with 3 quarts, which I have not seen, although those were applied on Bermuda a little later in the season than what we had done on the zoysia in early February. And so the cold temperature may have had an influence on its performance. I think that's something I need to do more research on, is maximizing the performance of glufosinate, because a lot of people are being forced to shift away from glyphosate and towards glufosinate. Resistance. That's another reason we may shift away from glyphosate on warm season turf, dormant cleanup. There's a lot of glyphosate resistance, a lot of simazine or trizine resistance, most of it in the southern United States. All the red dots there were resistant populations in our recent SCRI project. You can still get injury from Anderson's crab and goose on warm season turf, just like you can on cool season turf. This is from Jay McCurdy at Mississippi State. Dr. Harold Walker did a lot of the early work on warm season turf with POA Cure. This is what we're looking at here. A lot of these are effective treatments that Dr. Walker had evaluated. These are fall programs at various rates. 1,000 grams is going to be 2 times the normal greens rate. He put it out only twice there. In this case, 2,000 grams twice. This is on fairway height, doing a really good job. compared to, Amazon, or I'm sorry, amikarbazole. And he's got some other really high rates there as well, looking beautiful on the turf. Patrick McCullough, also warm season greens work showing effective PoaCure programs. Again, fall programs. How to use PoaCure on Bermuda. We've done a lot of work. I don't have time to show a lot of it, but one of the things we're seeing is you do not want to use this product on warm season turf, particularly ultra dwarf greens, within a month of green up. So this is a normal time to use other products when the greens are still predominantly dormant, but they're getting ready to start green up. Normally with herbicides, that is a safer time to apply products versus during green up. With PoaCure, it's the exact opposite. You want the greens to be at least 50% green up before you start applying PoaCure if you're going to do spring applications. Otherwise, my recommendation on Bermuda grass, on collars and dormant ultra dwarf, is to go after fall and winter programs that are meant to knock down and then provide residual pre-activity, like during covering or other situations that lead to POA populations, especially on that collar and that transition right as you're coming onto the green. Why would we use PoaCure? If you have resistance to the cheaper chemistry or if you have adjacent sensitive turf, that would be a great reason to justify the cost of PoaCure. These are current strategies for ultra dwarf greens. And I know we're running out of time, apologize. ALS herbicides such as Revolver, Monument, or Katana, big problem there is resistance. Curb right now is kind of the star of the show, in my opinion. A lot of people are transitioning to Curb because of resistance to these, the line on the top there. Typical program, 10 ounces applied 3 times, October, November, and December, or 15 ounces applied twice, which would be October and December. And those programs have looked really good on ultra dwarf greens going into the winter season. Anderson's Crab and Goose is also registered for this purpose. 150 pounds per acre in September has looked good in Jim Brosnan's work out of Tennessee. PoaCure also is something that we are currently investigating. And if everything that I've got to say on PoaCure for POA control on collars and greens, ultra dwarf greens, is a guess, because we put out 3 different trials and all 3 have been compromised by accidental oversprays from the golf course personnel. A lot of people hate that POA on their collars, but my guess would be October to January 15th. I would not go beyond January 15th with PoaCure applications on dormant Bermuda. And then there are some other experimental things that are being looked at as well. And I'll finish up with a little bit of work on summer annual grass control that we've done. Goosegrass and crabgrass aren't many options that you can use. We did a survey with superintendents. We asked them about what PGRs they were using, and pretty much 19 out of 28 transition zone superintendents that said they used Trenex ethyl, 10 of them had goosegrass on their greens. 9 of them said they used propimonol or paclitaxel. None of them said they used propimonol or paclitaxel. And so here's an example: non-treated Trenex ethyl, propimonol. Now ignore the turf color because it's bent grass in Alabama. But a student of mine has initiated a program based on some of these earlier observations, and he's getting pretty good control of both crabgrass and goosegrass. Here's cutlass. This is season long applied, cutlass being applied every 3 weeks. Primo Max and Trim It. And here's the rates. So cutlass at 12 ounces every 3 weeks, giving you pretty good crabgrass control. This is on bent, but the premise is for greens and collar management, and it could apply to Bermuda as well, depending on the tolerance that you have on your Bermuda. And then Trim It 10 ounces every 3 weeks. Also have an activity, but on the bent, Trim It was reducing bent grass quality and allowing more crabgrass to come in late season. We're also looking at programs with PoaCure for crabgrass and goosegrass control, and it's working pretty well. This is half of the recommended rate every 2 weeks, keeping crabgrass out of our green there, and also the full rate, 0.6 fluid ounce per 1,000 every 2 weeks. And looking at it on collars at the river course, the Pete Dye River Course at Virginia Tech, we're targeting goosegrass at this site, but POA, it turns out, is causing serious issues with collar management with this approach. because the POA cure controls all the POA and it leaves the collars looking pretty crappy. And so that's something that we're going to have to figure out how to manage, because if you're in the middle of a program with repeated applications of POA cure, you're not going to be able to grow in this loss of POA. What we're trying to do is keep crab and goose out, but we're killing the POA in the process. So managing the POA might be year one before you get on these aggressive summer programs. Either that or you may have to sod out the collars and start clean, because that's an issue. What if you have this much POA? It's going to be a disaster. But here's an untreated check, and this is a POA cure program that, it didn't kill every goosegrass plant, but it definitely reduced a non-pickable situation down to something that you can pick with a pocket knife. All right, way out of time. Our 15 minutes for questions is down to 6 minutes. I'll stay as long as you want, but I know you guys and gals have more important things to do. So let's open it up for questions. And I'll stop sharing. All right, let's go. All right, you're muted. You're muted, Eric.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, if anybody wants to raise their hand, I can unmute you, or you can use the question and answer section here to ask any questions you may have. I don't see any questions in there quite yet. Give them a minute. That was a lot to cover in an hour, huh?
Yeah, I knew it was going to be a mad rush at the end there, and it certainly was. Their head's probably still swimming. That's why there aren't any questions. But surely, I mean, someone's got to have a comment or a question about the yellow tire tracks. I mean, I know everyone has seen that on their course. And, I always thought it was because the tires lay the turf over. And I'm not abandoning that theory. But, we're getting 3x deposition behind the tires. And I know with some products, that's definitely going to cause phyto.
Yeah, the one question I had was more related around seed head control. There was some information presented to us a few weeks ago regarding elevated seed head control with the addition of a new over primo. And I was curious, with all the work you've done with Proxy, any comments on that?
Yeah, so we do see elevated seed head control when you switch to a new, but we also see elevated phyto on the POA. So our overall turf quality goes down. But it's a great way, depending on your site and your quality needs, it's a way not only to get increased seed head control, but increased suppression as well. But in some sites, that increased suppression might not be desirable at that time of year. Because when we're going after seed heads, man, that's, for the mid-Atlantic, that's our revenue generating time of year. And you just, you can't have extremely poor quality that, leads to a lot of bad chatter, because it can really hurt revenue generation moving forward. And so everybody's trying to manage phyto and overall turf quality. But yeah, a new gives a slight bump. Proxy's still carrying the load. And my standard seed head suppression program is the fall winter program. So you're coming out with 5 ounces of Proxy on your targeted sites sometime between the 15th of November and the 15th of February. Anywhere in that window that you can get out and put the application out, that's going to dramatically improve a spring only program. And you follow up with the growing degree day based initiation in the spring. And typically that's going to be 5 ounces at it's 50 base 50. And I can't remember how many base. I think it's for greens, it's 200 base 32, but
you're right, 200 or 250.
Anyway, and then follow with a month later another 5 ounces. But a lot of people have seen better performance by putting out, say, 2 ounces to 2.5 ounces on a 2-week interval during that season. So if that fits your normal spray program and regime, great. But there's during that time of year, there's frost delays and a lot of things that manipulate your ability to get on the greens.
I got one question that came up, a few actually. First one from Robert Klein. How do you accurately apply PoaCure to small test plots?
All right, so I wish I knew where a great image was and I would show you, but we carry a backpack that has about a 5-pound pressurized carbon dioxide canister in it. Same type of thing that you would use for beverage dispensers. And so this CO2 canister pressurizes through a regulator small bottles, and that's linked to a aluminum pipe boom. And that boom has, in our case, 4 nozzles that are spaced 18 inches apart. So we spray 6-foot plots. We also have some smaller, like the greens work you saw, we have a small hooded sprayer, same premise. We hook up our CO2 pressurized system to a small green sprayer with a hood, and it's got 2 nozzles underneath. And so that's how we spray our research plots. And we spray those with TTI 110-06 nozzles at about somewhere close to, it's in the mid 40s pressure, and the output is it's 40 GPA. It's 1 gallon per thousand. It's close enough, but we calibrate 40 GPA.
Great. Kevin Fortune asks, with greens that approach 50-50 POA bent populations, is PoaCure a tool that can be used in possibly a one-time spring or fall, or fully rely on PGRs until the population diminishes to a point to use PoaCure?
Well, so in most of Virginia, the populations will fluctuate. So if your peak population in spring is about 50%, your late summer population is going to be about 20%. And then in the fall, it's going to start to come back. All right. If it's an intensively managed, like resort core screen, that's been getting a lot of PGR use, et cetera, then a high portion of your POA will be perennial POA. And in that case, the population dynamics don't sway quite as much as it does with the annuals. But the way PoaCure is intended to be used is that your 3 spring applications, 0.6 ounce each, you start applying once your bent grass is recovered from aeration and it's happily growing. Now your POA, and it's really it's frustrating that you have to sit there for all of late winter and watch POA expand and expand and expand to that spring maximum, that 50% if that's your situation. But it's still the best scenario, because what you're going to do is, by putting PoaCure out 3 times in the spring, normally what we see, not always, is pretty serious discoloration to that POA, but we don't blow it out. And in many cases, we don't really see massive reduction in the overall population density. We see slight discoloration, and by all appearances, maybe the POA is pushing through. But what ends up happening is when we go into summer decline, which is a natural phenomenon of POA, the summer decline will be lower, and we're holding that POA at a lower level coming back into the fall. We wait until we get our root regeneration from the bent grass. So we're going to be coming out in most areas of Virginia, it's going to be on or after October. And then you'll start with another 2 fall applications. And it's those fall applications that actually kill the POA. And along with winter stress, they keep the spring population from bouncing back. And so once you've gone through 2 cycles of that process, it typically leads to near complete renovation. The fact that you have 50% POA, if you stay on the program as intended, there is a risk there, but it should not be. So if you're getting too much phyto from the PoaCure, you can delay the repeat application. Normally we're on a 3-week interval, but the interval is not really that important. It's a struggle. How do you go from 50-50? And the question was, should we go to PGRs and reduce? PGRs are going to do no different. They're going to piggyback on summer stress to reduce the overall POA population. And as soon as you turn your back and walk away from a trim it program, the POA bounces back so fast It's really summer induced plus PGR reduction of POA population. But anytime you're in prime time growing conditions, you're still fighting the POA. If you get on a PGR program early and you don't have a lot of aerification issues, then you possibly can reduce the spring expansion. But right now, we really don't have a good solution for reducing that spring explosion of POA, because we've got variable environmental conditions, we got aerification healing, and so, well, those two right there are enough. We can't come out with something like POA cure when we'll be placing the turf at risk. We'll be placing, I mean, our biggest risk is that some environmental issue happens that causes the POA cure to blow the POA out. And then you're dealing with compromised putting conditions. And so I think, the program that's currently being proposed for POA cure, it's not perfect, but after 10 years of research, it's the best compromise that could be reached based on the risk that are inherent in what we're trying to do.
Yeah, and my recommendation, it would be to work with your sales rep to kind of determine that population and work a custom plan for your facility. And it may be just some greens on your facility that maybe you treat a little bit differently than the rest of them. And
it's not uncommon with POA cure to actually do specific per green management. You don't necessarily do the exact same thing on every green. That's right.
Yeah, and we've got some really good resources and history with Key Young's experience as well to kind of pull from to help support you, Kevin, on that question. So, let's get back in touch and follow through on your situation, because I think there is a solution that POA cure could be used properly.
It can be done at 50-50. I've done it many times. It many times. It can be done smoothly, but it can also, you can see things like what I showed in the image where, the POA checks out too quickly. And that's our big challenge. And that's why the programs are the way they are, and Kyung does have the experience to, and with him working with you guys, you're going to get the best shot. I mean, when you're comparing it to a renovation, there's a lot of meat on that bone, but unfortunately, that's not the bar we get compared against when we're trying to take 50-50 POA bent back to pure bent. We get compared against, I want everything to be perfect at all times while I get rid of this 50% POA. And that's unrealistic.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Askew, I can't thank you enough for the time today. It was an awesome presentation. I want to remind those that are on, there's a QR code here for the next one, which is October 13th. We have Steve McDonald joining us for that. So you can use your phone to use this QR code, as well as you can see that we've got a great lineup of speakers coming up for the rest of fall. On November 10th, we'll have Bill Maynard, and December 8th, we'll have Pat Jones. There's GCSAA credits, CEUs available for these series of webinars that we're offering. And I just wanted to, share that information again. You'll be getting continuous email reminders as well regarding the other webinars that are coming up. But on behalf of W.S. Conley, Landscape Supply, Walker Supply, 10-Board Seed, Dr. Askew, I just want to thank you so much for your time and all the things that you've done for this industry and continue to do to help support golf course superintendents and turf managers across the nation. So thank you so much. Really appreciate everything you presented today.
Yeah, glad to be here. And I did see one question pop up: how to control ryegrass on bent POA collars. We really don't have good options for that. Your two viable options to consider, well, I can't say that. Let me just say that research that we've done has shown that low rates of metsulfuron applied repeatedly, and I couldn't tell you the rates or how to dial it in, and also 0.1 ounce per acre katana in research has shown differential selectivity. In other words, you're going to control or harm perennial rye more than POA and bent with lower rates, say probably 0.1 to 0.2 metsulfuron and 0.1 katana. But those are not registered for that situation. We really don't have outside of that. Chlorsulfuron used to be registered to take rye out of bent, but it's no longer, used to be marketed as a product called Corsair. It's no longer on the market.
Gotcha. Well, thanks everyone for your attendance today. Since we ran a little bit long, about 10 minutes long, which is great. I think it was good information. Thank you again. Have a great rest of your week, and hope to see you next month with Steve McDonald.
All right. Thanks a lot. If anybody has other questions, by all means, email me and we'll see if we can't get them figured out.
Thank you.